Hello, everybody. This is part 2 of the Civil War. Let me move this back a little bit. There we go. We're picking up where we left off. And I believe that we had talked about the Republican Economic Plan. Yes? Transcontinental Railroad, greenbacks, income tax, rural land grant, colleges, all that stuff. Did we talk about the draft? Okay, and the fact that people did not like the draft. As a matter of fact, they rioted against the draft. Did we talk about opposition to Lincoln, the Copperheads? Yeah. Okay, Clement Vallandigham, member of Congress, being arrested and exiled. Okay, did we get to Ex parte Merriman? All right. I don't know if this is ever going to be on a test. I just think it's interesting. Okay. Ex parte Merriman, this is where the Supreme Court ordered the release of an individual whose First Amendment, Fourth Amendment, Fifth Amendment, tons of rights have been violated. John Merriman was one of these individuals who was rounded up in the suspension of habeas corpus in Maryland in April 1861, and he sued for his freedom. He demanded that he get his freedom, that he had been arrested and detained in violation of his rights, as outlined in the Bill of Rights. The Supreme Court agreed with John Merriman and ordered Abraham Lincoln to release John Merriman and others who had been unduly detained. Lincoln ignored the Supreme Court order. Because he believed it was a military necessity to keep these people detained in order to save the Union. All right. So there are lots of things where you could look at Lincoln violating the Constitution. Suspension of habeas corpus, the draft, overextended powers of the executive, broad powers of the executive here. But all of it is couched in the idea of saving the Union. And probably the most controversial of Lincoln's decisions is the emancipation of slaves. And how did Lincoln arrive at the conclusion that the only course of action was to free slaves when he promised that he wouldn't touch slavery in 1861? And he brought that up in his inauguration address, that he didn't believe he had the power to deal with slavery where it currently existed. But now he does believe he has the power to deal with slavery, because it's gone from a legal issue to a military necessity. And as commander-in-chief, he has broad powers to act in order to save the Union. Now, Lincoln has got a lot of pressure on him from several fronts. One area of pressure are the radical Republicans, people like Thaddeus Stevens, Benjamin Wade, Charles Sumner after the beating, Henry Winter Davis of Maryland. These guys today would be your civil rights advocates. These are the guys who are not only pushing for freedom for slaves, they're pushing for citizenship rights, they're also pushing for voting rights for slaves, for freedmen. So the pressure that he's getting from these radicals is forcing Lincoln to consider emancipation. But in 1862, he's not there yet. 1861, he's not there. 1862, he's not there. But some factors are are putting pressure on. The radical Republicans, pressure. The fact that John C. Fremont in Missouri and Benjamin Butler in Maryland are using escaped slaves as labor puts the question of what to do with freedmen in Lincoln's lap. Out in Missouri, John Fremont says, all such property is hereby declared to be lawful subject of prize and capture wherever found, and it shall be the duty of the President of the United States to cause the same to be seized, confiscated, and condemned. Fremont is basically saying that when the Union Army goes through a plantation area, the slaves as property are now prizes of war. Property. So it goes from the slave owner to the Union Army. Ownership. So Lincoln is basically saying, wait a minute. We're going from one system of ownership to another. And it's not just John Fremont who's doing this in Missouri. Here in Maryland, Benjamin Butler is also taking slaves off of plantations and treating them as property of the Union Army, what he called contraband. So Lincoln doesn't want slaves moving from one system of ownership to another, so the question becomes, great, once an area is liberated, what do you do with the freedmen who are there? What is their status? So that question has to be answered. Here's the thing that kept Lincoln up at night. Fear of the British. Fear of the British coming in and siding with the South. Now, why would the South side, or why would the British side with the South? Yeah, because of the cotton, okay? Cotton for European textiles, England in particular. So there was that fear. Plus the fact that the British leadership tended to sympathize with the planter elites. You had elites running the government in Britain. They found common cause with the elites running the plantations in the South. They felt that they were kind of kin, as it were. And so the British government's inclination was to side with the South. Now, Lincoln recognized that if the British continued to side with the South and supply weapons and money and ships, that the South could survive for a long period of time, and that would not save the Union. So this was definitely a concern. Now, it comes to a head after something called the Trent Affair. The Trent was a ship. It was a British ship carrying Confederate ambassadors to Britain. Those ambassadors were John Slidell and John Mason. Yes, John Slidell, late of the Slidell mission to Mexico in the Polk administration. Well, Slidell is a Confederate. And the Union blockade surrounding the Confederacy, the Union blockade is going to stop this British ship. Slidell and Mason and take them off the Trent. The British government gets themselves all in an uproar over this. How dare, and I love this, how dare you violate our freedom of the seas by stopping British ships in this fashion? And so Lincoln is forced to release Slidell and Mason and issue an apology to the British government. Now, why does Lincoln do this? To keep Britain out of the war. Because it is clear that the British would love nothing more than to help the South out, because the British need that cotton. Plus the fact that the British are building ships for the South. Ships like the Alabama, the Florida. These were what were called blockade runners. They were fast ships capable of carrying cotton past the Union blockade. Lincoln was also getting pressure from Frederick Douglass and others within the black community to do something. Douglass is trying to sway Lincoln about the moral imperative of emancipation. He says there is no Negro problem. The problem is whether the American people have loyalty enough, honor enough, patriotism enough to live up to their own Constitution. Douglass says to Lincoln, stop being a hypocrite. The U.S. government has to stop being hypocritical. Either they believe in freedom and liberty or they don't. So Lincoln's getting pressure from the radicals in his party. He's getting pressure from the black community. He's getting pressure from the British. He's getting pressure from his generals. Something has to be done. And so, declaring emancipation will do several things. One, it will change the tenor of the war from one to save the Union to a war of liberation, freedom. That's something everybody can get behind. It would keep Britain out of the war, because while the British government may need that cotton, making this a war for liberation and to end slavery appealed to the average British person, who was generally pro-abolition, because they had all read Uncle Tom's Cabin. So when this becomes a war for freedom, the British government cannot back slave owners, and they stay out. The radicals in Lincoln's party are appeased. Hey, I freed the slaves. What do you want now? And finally, it undermines the Southern economy. If there are no slaves, they can't produce the cotton. The South can't make money. They cannot continue the war, and therefore the war would come to an end, thereby saving the Union. So Lincoln issues an executive order. That's what the Emancipation Proclamation is. It's an executive order by the Commander-in-Chief to conduct a wartime measure. Emancipation was a wartime measure in order to save the Union. So while Lincoln didn't think that he, as president, could do anything about slavery, as commander-in-chief, he could. Emancipation happens January 1st, 1863, and it declares that slaves within any state or designated part of a state then in rebellion shall be thenceforth and forever free. So on January 1st, 1863, how many many slaves were freed? 0. Give you an opportunity to help yourself out. Fix your answer. Why is it 0? Look at the wording. Yeah. Well, I don't know. That's a great question. You know what? You posited a really great question. Have the states that seceded from the Union, are they still states? Lincoln says yes. The South says no. Radical Republicans say no. Lincoln still believes, though, Lincoln never recognizes the Confederacy, never recognizes Jefferson Davis, never recognizes the authority of the Confederate government. He just says they are United States in a state of rebellion. He never recognizes the Confederate States of America as an independent country. Matter of fact, nobody did. Why 0?
They didn't have any way to enforce it.
Right. Southern states didn't recognize the authority of Abraham Lincoln. So, in a state of rebellion, those states are not going to free their slaves. So on January 1st, no slaves are freed. However, as the Union goes through and liberates areas, those slaves will be freed, which is great, but, what are they going to do? They have no land, they have no property, this is great, you're giving them freedom, but now what? That's a big, huge question. Now what? New Orleans was under the control of the Union, slaves not freed there. Hampton Roads and Norfolk was under the control of the Union in 1863, slaves not freed there. Tennessee was under military rule. It had been liberated from the Confederacy in 1862 thanks to the efforts of Ulysses Grant. Slaves not freed there. And, most significantly, in the border states, those states were allowed to keep their slaves until the end of the Civil War. As a matter of fact, here's the answer to Final Jeopardy. The last state in the Union to have slaves legally was Delaware. In 1867, they had slaves. Granted, they had like 60 of them, but all right, so what do free blacks do? Now, you're a slave, now you're free. What are your options? What can you do? You join the army. And a lot of blacks join the army. Now, a lot of people in the South and in the North look at this action and they say, Lincoln is using black troops. He's desperate. The war is going badly for the Union, and so Lincoln is playing the race card. He's using black soldiers. He's going to blackify the entire country. But this was and Frederick Douglass was one of the proponents of using black troops, that, if this was a war of liberation, then blacks had to have some skin in the game. That they had to ante up and fight like men. I could do the whole quote. I could do all the quotes from the movie Glory. Anybody ever see the movie Glory? Really? No? You did? Okay. Fantastic movie. It's about an all-black regiment that was formed in 1863 in the Civil War. Matthew Broderick is the white commander of the forces. He plays Robert Gould Shaw, leading the 54th Massachusetts. By the way, the 54th Massachusetts, probably the most well-known of the all-black regiments during the Civil War, as 75% of their numbers were killed in the Battle of Fort Wagner. in the summer of 1863. And I'm talking a lot of people were killed from the 54th Massachusetts. Matthew Broderick was killed. Morgan Freeman was killed. Denzel Washington was killed. They were all killed. Sorry for the spoiler. They all died. Carrie Elways was killed. They were all killed. At the Battle of Fort Wagner in the summer of 1863, in the mouth of Charleston Harbor, it was a suicide mission to try to capture the fort, but the 54th Massachusetts volunteered for the mission, volunteered to lead the charge, even though they knew there would be heavy casualties, and there were. Okay, but mainly, blacks were used as labor in the army, which was kind of ignominious, but there were a lot of white commanders because blacks were not allowed to have black commanders. Okay, you had black regiments, but they were commanded by white officers. And the whites got paid more than the blacks. Denzel Washington says, black man stop a bullet just as good as a white man, and for less money, too. So blacks were used mainly as labor in the army. What about women? What about women? What'd they do? Yeah. Nurses, medics, battlefield help, absolutely. You can see here a lot of Confederate soldiers had their wives and their kids in camp with them. The wives cooked the meals, sewed the uniforms, helped out, patched people up. But you start to see some prominent American women take a role. For instance, Dorothea Dix. Where have we heard of her? Prison reform and insane asylum reform. She is going to lead the U.S. Sanitary Commission to promote sanitation in battlefield hospitals, cleanliness to prevent the spread of contagion. One of the number one killers of soldiers on the Union and the Confederate side was infection and disease contracted in camp. And then the other well-known woman who made a name for herself, Clara Barton, founds the Red Cross. This is a neutral organization that goes out on the battlefield, helps out Confederates and Union victims in battle. The Red Cross is going to take off after the Civil War, spread around the world. You've got various constructs of the Red Cross. You've got an Islamic version of the Red Cross, the Red Crescent. I mean, it serves the same function. But you've got women taking the lead in reform efforts here coming out of the Civil War. Women are emboldened. They've got a role to play during the Civil War. What kind of problems did the South encounter during the war? Timmy. Okay, they're running out of money, and the only thing that they can rely upon is cotton, and they're running out of the ability to sell cotton because the North isn't buying it, and the blockade is keeping Southern cotton from making it to Europe. So the South is running out of money. That's a problem. What else? Yeah, they couldn't make enough food. That was a problem. You know, it's really bad when you're fighting a war and you're not getting fed and you're not getting paid. That's a problem. What other problems did the South have? They're running out of people. You're right. They're running out of soldiers. They're running out of people. The war, it's a war of attrition. I mean, they're just whittling down the population of the South here. Plus the fact that Jefferson Davis wasn't a particularly good president. He was not persuasive. He was not charismatic. He couldn't get the southern states all on the same page. I mean, why did the southern states secede in the first place, aside from slavery? What did they believe in?
The United States for violating their rights.
That's right. They believed in states' rights. So when the president of the Confederate States of America tells Mississippi to do this, or tells Alabama to do that, or tells Georgia to do that, Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia are essentially going to tell Jefferson Davis to go fly. States' rights. So you've got, guys, that's the problem with a Confederate form of government. You cannot have these individual states on their own, and Davis can't get these states to do the things that he wants them to do. So they're not on the same page. And they're running out of money. So what does the Confederacy do? They just start printing paper money. But the paper money's not backed by anything, so the paper money's worthless. So they're running out of money. A lot of soldiers who fought for the Confederacy were poor yeoman farmers who didn't own any slaves. Now, some of that was based on the carrot and stick philosophy. I would like to defend the slave system because if slaves are freed, then I'm put on the same level as blacks. A lot of it is I'd like to someday own slaves too. But another reason why you have a rich man's war and a poor man's fight is because if you owned 10 or more slaves, you were exempt from fighting. You had to be back on your plantation or your farm taking care of your slaves. So these big-time slave owners, while some of them did volunteer to fight, they were not compelled to fight. They were not drafted to fight. They got an excuse. So a lot of poor Southerners, as the war is dragging on and they're having to make sacrifices and their farms are suffering and their wives are suffering and their children are suffering, they're saying, wait a minute, why are we doing this? We were doing this to defend a slave system that's run by planter elites that have no skin in the game? And then women in the South, as their husbands are off fighting, they're having to manage farms, run plantations, oversee the crops, take care of business. They're basically doing a man's work. And don't get me started on the female spies in the South who would lure Union soldiers into their midst to find out information. That was another thing that went on. God, I wish I had time to talk about all this. The topic of female spies for the Confederacy, using what they had to get information from the Union. That's good stuff right there. That's good storytelling. Unfortunately, it's never on an AP exam, and we don't have time to talk about it. But if you ever do take a Civil War class, or you take a women's studies class that talks about women in the Civil War, that's a great topic. It gets really bad when in January 1865, Jefferson Davis issues an executive order mandating that slaves be used as soldiers. When you're having to resort to slaves being used as soldiers to defend the system of slavery that will keep them enslaved, that's like the end of the universe. That's where you got to kind of figure it's game over. Yeah, we're having to resort to using the slaves to defend slavery. My head hurts. It's like being on a corner and seeing a Starbucks and then looking across the street catty corner and seeing another Starbucks. You've reached the end of the universe. I know. They love their coffee, man. They love their coffee. All right. Now, the war itself, they do not ask a lot of questions about the war itself. They mainly ask about battles that lead to something else. The battle leads to something else. Okay? They're not going to ask about the Battle of Vicksburg. They're not going to ask about the Battle of Chattanooga. As compelling as all those battles are, the Battle of Chancellorsville, okay, Stonewall Jackson was killed. They're never going to ask that, all right? But they will ask about a battle that leads to the passage of the Emancipation Proclamation, or the battle that represents the turning point in the war, or the battle that secures Abraham Lincoln's reelection. They'll ask about that. What was the strategy for victory on both sides, and how did the war play out? What was the strategy for the Union? Yeah.
Surround the South and eventually set them off until they gave up.
Okay, do you know what that was called? Well, the blockade was part of it. Yeah. The Anaconda Plan. Absolutely. Conceived by none other than old Fuss and Feathers himself, Winfield Scott, who, by the way, is like 70-some years old, 300 pounds. The man can hardly move. And yet, he's still in command of the army, and Lincoln says, hey, Winfield, buddy, wake up. I need a battle plan. So, drawing upon his 50-plus years of military experience, Winfield Scott comes up with the idea of surrounding the South. Blockade. Prevent the South from getting materials out to the rest of the world. That cuts off their lifeline. Then, cut the South into pieces and constrict, like an anaconda snake. And Scott said it was imperative to control the rivers. This is where the South's obtuse decision-making comes back to bite them in the butt. They didn't want railroads. They didn't want turnpikes. They said, oh, we got rivers. We can load stuff on boats. We'll be fine. Well, that's great. If you control the rivers, you have no ability to move troops and supplies. And Scott recognizes that. So the Anaconda Plan is the plan that the Union is going to use. And then Lincoln forces Scott to retire. We need younger, thinner generals. Lincoln literally does it. He says, hey, great, that's a fantastic plan. Now I need you to retire. And so the battle cry is on to Richmond. They believed in the summer of 1861 that they were going to be able to march from D.C. down to Richmond, and that would be it. The war would be over with by the end of the summer. That was the belief of the Union, that this was going to be quick. The Southern strategy was to sit and wait. Let the Union come to you. Draw them in, and trap them. That was the Southern strategy. Sit and wait. It was a defensive war. And just drag it out, and hope that the Union eventually gives up and gets sick of it. Drag it out as long as you can. So the first major battle, and again, we're not going to go into all these battles here, but the first major battle is the Battle of Manassas. This is part of the on to Richmond strategy. Hey, we're going down I-95. Boom! And they run into the Confederates at Manassas. The Union calls it the Battle of Bull Run. Easy way to remember battle names. Union calls it by the nearest body of water. South calls it by the nearest town. So the Battle of Manassas is the Battle of Bull Run. And at the Battle of Bull Run, Stonewall Jackson is going to, the Confederate commander is going to defeat General McDowell, and McDowell will promptly be fired. And what the Battle of Bull Run revealed to a lot of people was that this was not going to be quick. It was not going to be easy. It was going to be very long, drawn out, and painful. So everybody strap in. McDowell is fired and replaced by General George B. McClellan. He looks good in a uniform. As a matter of fact, if you take a look here at a typical Union encampment, the tents look good, soldiers look good. This guy is the author of the Army Training Manual that's used up until the 20th century. So the man knows how to get people to line up, knows how to get them to march, knows how to get them to look good in a uniform. The only thing McClellan doesn't know how to do is fight. Now, if it had been, if the initial battle cry had been on to Richmond, McClellan's idea is to do a bootleg. And he says, all right, I got a really great plan. I'm going to take the couple of thousand soldiers that we have in the Union Army that's sitting here in Washington. Here's Manassas, okay? That's where Bull Run was. We want to get to Richmond. So rather than go down 95, which can be clogged with traffic, especially around that Springfield interchange, and if you're heading down the Quantico Triangle, rather than do that, I'm going to load all of our troops on barges. And I'm going to send them down the Potomac River. And then I'm going to unload these thousands of soldiers here on the peninsula and march them up the peninsula. How long do you think this is going to take? A long time. Months. And the South's not just sitting there picking their nose. The South is right here. They're sitting there monitoring them as they go down. So it's not like they didn't know what was coming. So this gives Robert E. Lee the opportunity to build up his reinforcements here. And when eventually McClellan reaches Lee's forces and encounters Lee, by the way, Lee, talk about making chicken salad out of chicken crap, okay? Here's a guy who's way outnumbered, way outgunned. So what does he do? He takes hay bales and forms them into the shape of cannons and paints them black to make McClellan think there's more artillery than there really is. In the middle of the night, he would have the cavalry ride circles around the Union camps to make the Union think that there were more Confederate soldiers than there really were. So McClellan was kind of frozen, believing he needed more reinforcements, and when Lincoln orders him to attack and he encounters the first element of resistance, McClellan runs away, back to Washington. So you've spent all of 1862 on this fiasco. So McClellan is promptly fired and replaced by General John Pope, who says, on to Richmond! And is promptly defeated at Manassas. Again, wait, haven't we already lived this story? Haven't we already done this? So Manassas, failure. Peninsula, failure. Back to Manassas, Second Bull Run, failure. 1862 is a really, really, really bad year for the Union. They can't seem to get out of their own way, and they've been through 3 generals. So when Pope is defeated August 30th, 1862, at Second Bull Run, Pope is fired and replaced by McClellan. Wait a minute, haven't we already had this guy? Nope, he's back. He's tanned, he's rested, he's ready. He's had a summer to think about it. And McClellan falls butt backwards into a victory at Antietam Creek in Maryland. Here's Sharpsburg. Here's the town. It's on the border. Here's Route 70. Here's the outlet mall. I kid you not, though. I mean, that really, it is how it is. The outlet mall's up there. Anyway, yeah, so McClellan falls butt backwards into a victory just because he was at the right place at the right time. What Lee was trying to do is he was trying to launch an invasion of Maryland to get Maryland out of the Union and to join the Confederacy. He believed that that would be a major coup. And McClellan, with help, is able to stop him. But here was the problem. Lee retreats. But McClellan stays put. And Lincoln says, "Why aren't you going after him?" And McClellan says, and I kid you not, this was the reason McClellan gave. "My horses are tired." So Lincoln gets in his carriage and travels all the way heck out to Sharpsburg to talk to McClellan about his tired horses. And he gives McClellan an order, a direct order. You will, and the letter is, you will move the Army of the Potomac on or by this day. And McClellan ignores the order. And so McClellan is promptly fired again.
Why would you ignore that?
Because McClellan did not respect or like Lincoln. Thought Lincoln was, he called him the Big Ape. If you read here's the thing. If you read the correspondence between McClellan and his wife, where he's complaining about Lincoln, if Lincoln would just get out of McClellan's way and let McClellan fight the war the way he wants to fight the war. Lincoln doesn't know anything about tactics. He doesn't know anything about warfare. He was just a National Guard captain back in Illinois during the Black Hawk War. What the hell does he know about fighting major battles?
So after the first time he fires him, he thinks he doesn't have the nerve to fire him.
Exactly. Well, and this was the thing. The troops loved McClellan. Why?
They look good.
No. Well, not just because they look good.
Lots of rest breaks.
There's lots of rest. That's exactly it. That's why they loved McClellan. McClellan didn't think that Lincoln would ever fire him because Lincoln would lose the support of the troops who loved McClellan. But McClellan is fired and replaced by Ambrose Burnside with his sideburns, which is where the name comes from. And so Burnside's strategy is on to Richmond. Only let's not go through Manassas. Let's go through Fredericksburg. And it's a failure. So, guys, about the only victory the Union had in Virginia in 1862, if you want to call it a victory, was Antietam.
Maryland.
Yes, it was in Maryland. Yeah, and exactly, it was in Maryland. Exactly, yes.
I'm confused how they won. So,
How did who win?
how the Union won that battle.
Which battle? Antietam? Because if you want to get technical about the strategy, because the Union was able to control that bridge.
Well, did who retreated?
Lee retreated. Lee, in red, retreated. Lee was trying to invade Maryland. Lee did not succeed in invading Maryland, yet McClellan failed to pursue Lee back into Virginia. That's why he was fired. So while it was a victory, McClellan didn't follow it up. He had an opportunity to. Lee was on the run, but he didn't do anything about it. Seeing that this was the only victory, really, for the Army of the Potomac in 1862, this is the battle. This is the battle that leads to Lincoln declaring emancipation. Right after the Battle of Antietam, Lincoln announces that he's going to declare emancipation January 1st, 1863. So the main reason to know the Battle of Antietam is it gives Lincoln cover to declare emancipation. Because if he declares emancipation after a loss, he looks desperate. Here was a win. A win. So 1862, lousy year for the Union, except out west. Out west, the war's going really well for the Union because the Union is under the command of U.S. Grant. Now, Grant was a guy who was willing to take risks and engage in battle and maybe kill a soldier or two, since that's the whole purpose of war, is to kill soldiers and break things. And that's what Grant understood. And Lincoln looked around at the rest of his generals and said, you know, because they said that the rap on Grant was that he was a drunk. And he was. But Lincoln said, if I knew what brand of whiskey he drinks, I'd send a barrel to my other generals, because Grant fights. Grant gets results. Doesn't matter whether he's a drunk or not. He gets results. And in 1862, you can see what Grant is able to achieve. Fort Henry, Fort Donelson, he's able to gain control of the Tennessee and Cumberland River. When he gains control of these rivers and the Battle of Shiloh in April 1862, Tennessee is essentially taken out of the Confederacy. So Grant liberates Tennessee in 1862. And he's going to begin a march down the Mississippi River. He's working in conjunction with Admiral David Farragut, who's going up the Mississippi River with the idea of taking control of the Mississippi River to cut the Confederacy in half. That's part of Scott's Anaconda Plan. Notice where it's all going to come together. At Vicksburg. Technology, nothing leads to new technology like a stalemated war, because you're always looking for an edge. Probably one of the greatest technological innovations of the Civil War is the ironclad warship. It makes wooden ships obsolete. So everybody's navy in the world in 1862 is now obsolete. This is the Monitor. This is the, well, it depends on what you want to call it. It was a captured Union ship called the Merrimac. And they renamed it the Virginia. But the point of these ironclads was that they were to ram wooden ships and break through the blockade. And so you wind up with the Monitor versus the Merrimac at Hampton Roads, 1862. It is the first battle between iron warships, steel warships, really. And it changes naval warfare forever. You also have the repeating rifle, what's known as a Gatling gun. It's the precursor to the machine gun. I also threw a doctor's kit in there just to show you what they're working with. Yeah, a Gatling gun. Gatling gun was created in the Civil War. I actually think it was created before the Civil War. I think they used it in the Crimean War. All right, so what are the turning points? Anybody got the time? I don't have my phone with me. What's the time? Okay, we got to get to the end here. All right, so your big turning points in the war. By July 4th, 1863, Grant had, I have no idea what happened. Grant had captured Vicksburg, and Meade had defended Gettysburg from invasion. As a matter of fact, most people consider the Battle of Gettysburg to be the high watermark of the Confederacy, and Lee's loss at Gettysburg to be the turning point in the Civil War. The Confederacy is no longer able to make that kind of attack again. This was an attempt by Lee to bring the war to the North and sway public opinion. By 1863, a lot of people in the North were fed up with the war. They were tired of the war. A lot of Northerners wanted to make peace with the South and let the South go on their merry way. Democrats had made gains in the Congress. Copperheads were in the ascendancy at this point. So Lee was trying to take advantage of this by bringing the war to Northern soil, and he was looking for shoes. So after the Battle of Chancellorsville, where General Hooker was, by the way, Burnside had been fired after Fredericksburg. Hooker had fought at Chancellorsville. He had been fired, replaced by George Meade. Meade defeated Lee at Gettysburg, but didn't pursue Lee into Virginia. Meade was fired. Yes.
Why would Lee go to Gettysburg?
Because he wasn't trying to go to Washington, he was trying to bring the war up here into a northern state. He was actually trying to get Pennsylvania to convince Lincoln to sue for peace. Huh?
Lee was way up there and they didn't go after him.
Right. Meade did not go after him. Meade defeated Lee at Gettysburg, but didn't pursue him. And that's why Meade was fired. But that's okay. He gets a fourth. Yeah.
You would think that he would go follow him because the other guy got fired for not following.
Exactly. But what you had was military leadership that was very timid. They were not eager to engage in battle because they were afraid of losing too many troops. That was the fear of a lot of Union generals. Too many casualties. That's what makes Grant different. Grant is not afraid to kill soldiers. He's not afraid to lose soldiers in battle. That's the big rap against Grant, is that he was too willing to use Union soldiers and get them killed. They called Grant a butcher in the Union. But Grant fought, and Grant could count. 22 million, 9 million. If you kill them man for man, the Union's going to win. Grant could count. And that's why he engages with Lee. When Grant is putting command of the Union Army here in Virginia, Lee and Grant are going to go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, all throughout this wilderness area around Spotsylvania County. And then when Grant is promoted to the head of the Army of the Potomac, Grant's second in command, William Tecumseh Sherman, is going to launch the invasion of Georgia, the Battle of Atlanta, the March to the Sea, and then he's going to link up with Grant up here. I mean, that's all part of the Scott strategy. So the Battle of the Wilderness, that occupies most of 1864. Massive casualties on both sides. That's a big criticism. Spotsylvania Courthouse, Cold Harbor. The Petersburg Siege in 1864, Petersburg being just outside of Richmond. The whole goal was to capture Richmond. The criticism of Grant, of course, that he's too willing to suffer casualties, and I find it highly ironic that that's the criticism of Grant, considering the man literally would faint at the sight of blood. Oh, we don't have time for Andersonville. Here's the other guy. He looks crazy. William Tecumseh Sherman. He's in command of Union forces in Tennessee. He's going to break out of Tennessee and launch the invasion of Georgia. And this ultimately becomes a war of attrition, where you're just trying to wear down the other side. And they adopt, very controversially, a philosophy known as total war. Now look, here's the thing. Grant, Sherman, Lincoln are all on the same page with this. Civilians become a target. Wives, children, grandparents, family farms, plantations, businesses, towns, all of it is fair game. Why?
You're fighting a war and you lose your entire family.
Bingo! You destroy the will of the South to go on. That's the point of total war. And that's what a lot of these generals were unwilling to commit to, this idea of when you fight a war, you have to destroy the enemy's will to continue. Grant, Sherman, and Lincoln all understood that and very controversially practiced it. And if you were to ask Lincoln, why did you allow Union troops to rape women in the South? Why did you allow them to destroy plantations and burn family farms and attack children? What would Lincoln's answer be? Save the Union. Atlanta, the entire city is burned to the ground. Sherman burns the city because it's a railroad hub. And then marches to Savannah, destroying, raping, and pillaging everything in his path. Then turns towards South Carolina, and South Carolina is given special particular attention since they were the ones that had started this whole thing. Eventually, Sherman is going to accept the Confederate surrender outside of Durham. And that's technically the last surrender of the Eastern Campaign here. Now, in the 1864 campaign, Lincoln is running for re-election, and it's not sure whether he's going to win. Lincoln is thinking beyond the Civil War and nominates a new vice president. He dumps his old vice president, Hannibal Hamlin, Republican of Maine, and he names Andrew Johnson, Democrat from Tennessee, as his running mate, because Johnson had been the only Southern senator not to secede from the Union. He was placed in charge of Tennessee in 1862 when it had been liberated. He was the military governor of Tennessee, and now he was the nominee of Lincoln to be the vice president on the Union ticket. They don't even call it the Republican Party in 1864. They call it the Union Party. So Lincoln is thinking about unity, bringing the South back into the fold, the end of the Civil War. And who is Lincoln running against in 1864? George McClellan. The Democrats nominated him because they figured he had an axe to grind against Lincoln, and he did. But the problem with McClellan was that you had war Democrats and peace Democrats. McClellan was a war Democrat interested in keeping the Union together, but the Democratic platform was a peace Democrat platform, and the peace Democrats and the war Democrats couldn't get together and agree on it. Lincoln controlled the balloting. Lincoln gave soldiers permission to come home and vote. And Lincoln is going to be reelected in pretty much a landslide. And he's reelected mainly because of the Union victory in Atlanta, which pretty much convinced everybody that the war was coming to an end. So now, as Lincoln comes into his second term, and the Civil War is winding down, he says, we need to think about the end of the war. What are we going to do with the South? What are we going to do with free men? What does the assassination of Lincoln mean for the North and the South? In terms of the end of the war, Lincoln emphasizes compassion, leniency. Let's make it quick and painless to bring the South back into the Union. In his second inaugural, probably the most famous inaugural address ever, with malice toward none, bad feelings, malice. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in. Bind up the nation's wounds. Care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among nations, among ourselves and with all nations. Lincoln does not want this to be.
Good morning, Southern. Today is January 13th, a B-Day. Please stand for your pledge of allegiance.
Okay.
I pledge allegiance
To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Hang on.
Congratulations to the ITS academic team for their second place finish on Saturday. Stacey Cheney, Aaron Smith, and Catherine Donahue. It will air on February 22nd.
Are you a junior or senior interested in Virginia Tech ROTC program? A former Southern graduate who is currently a part of Virginia Tech's ROTC
Shelley Allen
program will be here January 15th to provide an information session. If you are interested in learning more about Virginia Tech's
So he's emphasizing leniency.
Please sign up at the guidance office ASAP.
All students who are planning to attend the University of North Carolina conference in March must attend the following meeting Tuesday morning.
Lincoln establishes something called the Freedmen's Bureau. This is a federal agency.
Mock trial meets today after school. The trial scheduled for Wednesday has been moved to Tuesday, January 14th.
Kudos to Austin Starnes, Dominic Newtile.
The Freedmen's Bureau is a federal agency designed to provide aid and relief to freed men, freed slaves. They provide.
Congratulations to Southern Swimming on
I
a
can't
job
battle
well
that.
done Saturday.
Can't battle
Although
it.
they fell to South River, they defeated Glen Burnie in North County with the girls scoring 127 points and the boys scored 128. Maggie Haley placed second in the 200 IM and the 500 free, and Ryan Barron placed second in the 100 backstroke. The team Lincoln had 13
We'll talk
states,
more about the Freedmen's Bureau
finishing in
next
19th
time.
place. The
Lincoln's
team, the
plan
company
we'll
is now
talk
ready
about
for
next
it.
time.
Come out to
The
Animal
Wade
Control
Davis
Center
bill,
for
which was the
free
radical
with
Republican counter to Lincoln's plan, we'll talk about next time.
Saturday, January
13th
18th,
Amendment frees all slaves. It's the last thing Lincoln gets accomplished.
Baseball players. There will be an
Richmond
informational
Falls in
meeting on Wednesday,
1865 in
January 15th
April.
after school in the weight room. If you are
Lee
interested in
surrenders to
playing
Grant
baseball
at
and you did not
Appomattox,
attend last week's meeting,
April
you're welcome
9th,
to come
1865. Lincoln
Big shout
says,
out to our Bulldog
"Thank God that Civil War is over. I think I'm going to go to the theater and find some enjoyment."
Scoring by Robbie Edwards, Jason Raymond.
And he's assassinated by John
Anyway,
Wilkes Booth
John
5 days
Riley
after
and
Lee's surrender. Dies April 15th, 1865.
Our next meeting is
How bad
Friday,
was the
January
security there?
31st. Look for this
It was
meeting
not good.
at King Peggy.
Um,
The real life story of an American secretary.
And then you've got a martyred president. The North blames the South for this, and the South is going to experience the revenge from this. I think the assassination of Lincoln is really the thing that did it in. I think the assassination of Lincoln is the thing that did it in for the South. You had a lot of Union people who were willing to go along with Lincoln's leniency, but when Lincoln is assassinated, they say all bets are off. Let's punish the South. And who knows what the future shall bring? Will the Reconstruction look like Lincoln's 10% plan? Will it look like the Wade Davis bill that required 50% of Southern states to swear a loyalty oath and give blacks the right to vote? That's never going to happen. Or will it look like something else? And who's going to be in charge of Reconstruction? Is it going to be the new president, Andrew Johnson? Or is it going to be the congressional Republicans? Is Congress going to try to take back some of the power that the executive had during the war? It's a real questionable time right after the Civil War, 1865, 66, 67. All right, we'll do that next time.